Alright, I've been kind of on a roll with the Agatha Christie mysteries lately, so here's one more Miss Marple mystery. Except really it's not exactly a Miss Marple mystery, it's more a standalone mystery in which Miss Marple just happens to show up and give us the answer and explain a few things at the end. Which is okay with me because although maybe I just haven't seen enough of Marple yet to really warm to her, she's fine, but just doesn't really enormously interest me other than just about any other nondescript detective. Sorry if that's heresy. Hopefully my opinion will change at some point. In this book, the central mystery revolves around a case of anonymous, scandalous, but seemingly untrue letters being sent to everyone in a village, but eventually escalates to the level of what looks suspiciously like murder. I liked the way that it's pretty suspenseful right from the get-go, but that level of suspense progressively escalates as we move from some impolite letters received in the mail to dead bodies found in the closet. But even from the first anonymous letter received by the narrator and his sister, it leads us to speculation in a way that I think was really well done. I'll talk more about this in the spoilers section, even though I could actually say quite a bit about how it affected my speculations here without really giving anything away. All in all, though, this was actually a really enjoyable mystery to read, and again, it brings a little variety in style. Though it's a country village murder mystery, it brings in a bit of life in the form of its main characters that bring it a little bit beyond simple cliché. That said, though, what Agatha Christie does well in this mystery, she only does well to a point, which is a small gripe that you'll notice recurring throughout this review, especially since I know she's done better on occasion on most of these fronts. So one thing I enjoyed, to a point, is the point of view of the narrator. Some readers seem to like Jerry Burton, others really dislike him because he's a bit of an oaf. I liked him because he's a bit of an oaf, making him different from the majority of Christie's main protagonists, who tend to be wholly sympathetic. Neither he nor his sister is the most likable. For his part, he has a sort of chauvinistic streak, eventually becoming rather attracted to the funny-faced Megan Symington, who looks rather like a horse, his words not mine. And this attraction is seemingly due to a sort of patronizing mindset in which he thinks he can help her. His sister Joanna is pretty annoying too. She has a very high opinion of herself and seems used to a high level of attention, particularly from all the men out there. She mistreats anyone who doesn't give her enough attention, including her brother, leading me for a bit towards the start of the book to wonder whether she might be the one writing the anonymous letters as another form of controlling the situation. I won't say any more on that particular topic until the spoiler section, though. On the other hand, moving back to Jerry, this book is supposed to be written from the point of view of a character who's become crippled due to a flying accident and is really trying to reckon with his new limitations, but aside from using this to set the stage at the beginning, it really doesn't seem to affect his personality or really even bring him down in any meaningful way that we can see from his narration. It feels more just like a way to set the scene, unless we're to infer that these new limitations create in him a sense of insecurity or inefficacy that compels him to take charge of the young Megan Symington and turn her into some sort of a proper woman. Unfortunately, there are also a lot of characters in this book, possibly too many to really make more than a few of them particularly interesting. Some of the characters I did enjoy meeting were the narrator and his sister, as I already mentioned, because I didn't like them and not because they were boring. Then, of course, there's this young Megan Symington, a girl who comes across and is perceived by others as immature for her age, but in a way that's arguably attributable to her parents, who've never given her any real responsibility. They pay her no attention and basically just treat her like a child, even after she's reached 20 years of age. Megan was, for me, a very interesting character, and due to her strained relationship with her mother, she can't really be ruled out as a murder suspect, which I'll elaborate on a bit more in the spoiler section of the review. I was also pleased that my recent reading and analysis of Shakespeare's King Lear this year actually came in handy for understanding Megan's character due to several references she makes to that work. Who else is there? The vicar's wife, Mrs. Dane Calthrop, is an interesting one, and at least from what we see of her early on, is one of the more admirable characters, particularly as she expresses sympathy for the writer of the letters, remarking that someone must be in a pretty miserable mental place to be seeking an outlet in anonymous letter writing. And then the doctor, Owen Griffith, is a bit interesting too. He's a little more mysterious though, and we learn more about him from observing his somewhat shifty but not usually outright suspicious personality than we do from him actually conveying stuff to us that we can take at face value. Then there were a few other characters that I think could have been interesting, but they just didn't really feel present enough to really care about them too much. Mr. Pye is an interesting guy, but he really gets the short end of the stick with limited direct interactions with our narrator. And then the rest of the attention he gets is basically just other people in the village alluding to how the crime is clearly the work of a woman, but effeminate and eccentric Mr. Pye basically counts as a woman, so we can't rule him out either. Miss Partridge, the housekeeper, I think, could be interesting, but in the end, it seems like she often ends up just being a conduit of information and observations rather than a full-blown character with personality. And then there's the doctor's wife, Miss May Griffith, who again shows a little personality, but just isn't really given that much room to develop. And then there are the other characters. Mr. and Mrs. Symington, their governess, Elsie Holland, the Reverend Dane Calthrop himself, Emily Barton, the one renting the house to our protagonist and to his sister. These characters never really come into the limelight enough to be anything but dull. They remain relevant as names we should have to keep in our suspects list, and not much more than that. All in all, I was left feeling like Christie should have reined in the number of characters to do justice to the ones who were there. Although I do also think there were probably some missed opportunities here for character development that were instead replaced with routine police work. I'm not the writer though, so I'll just leave it at that. And of course, as I mentioned, Miss Marple doesn't show up until shockingly late enough that it feels more like a cameo appearance than that she's actually the star of the show, and you'll constantly be checking the cover to see if it really did say Miss Marple or if you just somehow imagined that. So before I get into the spoilers, do I recommend it if you're not going for an exhaustive reading of everything Agatha Christie? Not really. I'd place it around the middle of the pack. If you enjoy having a few good characters, good for Christie's standards and the kind of story that this is, but can take a little bit of fluff around the rest of them who remain mostly cartoonish, you might enjoy it a bit more. If you enjoy the suspense and speculation of the mystery, but can take a final resolution that, if I'm going to be honest, felt like a bit of a patch-up job and really was not all that satisfying for me, then yeah, you might also enjoy this one above the average reader. If you're looking for a really tight mystery, though, without any unbelievable, inconvenient circumstances leading to a sort of merry-go-round of suspects at the end of the book, and with a murderer who you're really convinced by the end you should have seen all along, skip this one. So I'm going to go into spoilers now. I'll just give you a few seconds to pause and get out before I spoil this novel even more than its actual solution is already going to spoil it for you, because it's not one of the best. So a really big and really interesting question that is present from very early on in this novel, and that makes it stand out from any old case of anonymous letters, is this question of whether the anonymous letter writer is the same person as the murderer. Or, as an alternative, did the murderer somehow take advantage of the situation of the anonymous letters to make it look like it was the anonymous letters that drove the murdered woman to suicide, which was the initial interpretation formed by most of the characters. My theory from pretty early on after the murders happened, though, which seemed to hold up or maybe take a little more shape as we collected more evidence, was that the anonymous letter writer and the murderer were not the same person. This seems supported by the fact that the anonymous letters actually stopped once the murders were committed, suggesting that the person who'd written the anonymous letters was indeed afraid and didn't want to continue now that these two topics of investigation had been possibly linked to one another. And this would be true even if Mrs. Symington's death had been suicide, since the anonymous letter writer would have been implicated in instigating this death. It also seemed consistent with the fact that most of the letters were supposedly delivered, provably by post, while this one delivered right before death was found pretty early on to be hand-delivered. That is to say, I thought that the murderer had delivered this final anonymous letter, but that the rest had been the work of someone entirely different. Now, an important and relevant point in the actual solution to this mystery is the fact that, as far as we know, none of these letters are actually true, so any explanation for them has to account for this fact. But my working theory did account for it. At first, even before there was any murder, I was wondering whether the anonymous letter writer might be using these letters as a smokescreen, so to speak, to make it look as if a certain true fact that was known was actually false. Whether that true fact had actually been divulged or would come out along the way and therefore be assumed to be ridiculous was unclear, but as more details emerged later in the book, and when the narrator specifically attached the word smokescreen to this situation, I began to believe even more strongly that this was the case. In particular, Emily Barton, the woman renting out the house, seemed like a pretty strong candidate for the anonymous letter writer, as it emerged only later in the novel that she'd received an anonymous letter about someone knowing that she'd poisoned a relative or something like that, which, although a serious accusation, feels actually more credible than some of the garbage we'd seen elsewhere. For example, in the case of Mrs. Symington's suicide, it just seems hard to imagine that it could have actually been linked to the scandalous letter, which everyone seems to think is bogus. And in the case of the narrator and his sister not being actual siblings, it just seems ridiculous from everything that the narrator has told us. And all these other rumors of sexual indiscretions or something of the like seem to be of a totally different category than the notion that Emily Barton poisoned a relative. A rumor, by the way, that seemed to be held more tightly than the others, and I believe only came out when talking to the police. all suggesting that Emily may have been one of the earlier letter recipients, perhaps the earliest, and therefore would be a good candidate for the letter writer under this smokescreen theory. Add to this the fact that she seems embarrassed and reluctant to talk about these letters when visiting with the narrator, allegedly because she's embarrassed by the content, which is plausible for anyone. But could it be because she has trouble dissimulating about the origin of these letters, preferring instead to sit behind the safety of the post? And I think she fits the profile of a well-educated lady too, which is confirmed pretty early on, if we believe it, that the murderer fits this profile. Although we can't rule out another suspect that I'm about to mention in a bit who fits that description. But taking that all into account, I figured that quite likely what had happened was that the letter writer had been going along writing her letters when someone who was itching to do some actual murder saw this as an opportunity to bump off Mrs. Symington and make it look like suicide, simply in response to this final letter from a different person. Although I'd have to admit this would be a pretty clumsy murder compared with some of the genius stuff we've seen in the other books, such as the last Miss Marple book, The Body in the Library. But hey, not all murders are top-notch material, including the person who actually turns out to be the murderer in this novel right here. So I still consider this as a likely possibility because it fits with the facts. In any case, though, it was pretty safe to say by the time of the second death that we have a murderer on our hands, not just a suicide, and that this murderer was responsible for not one, but 2 murders. And in fact, there are a few excruciating points in this book where we have to sit through characters elaborating on some of the dumbest theories possible when there are clearly better explanations. If the term smokescreen can be properly applied to this mystery as the author implies, it's the amount of rot that we're exposed to on behalf of the official and unofficial investigators. I mean, it's one thing when police are coming to the same false conclusions as the reader, because they're the easiest explanations, but they just don't quite fit the facts. But in this case, they're willfully ignoring the easy explanations in a way that can only feel laughably transparent in that it's designed to avoid giving away obvious aspects of the correct answer too quickly. When we have the main character, I think it was, who's still convinced after the second murder has been committed that the first death could have been suicide in response to this anonymous letter, and then the second death was a murderer committed by a crazed person to cover up that she, or he, had accidentally instigated the first person's suicide, come on, this is simply ridiculous. If you sent someone an anonymous letter as a joke or even out of malice, and they committed suicide in response to it, you would go to the police and explain what you did. Or maybe, more believably, even if you're really, really scared, you stop with the anonymous letters, and as soon as you're exposed as the letter writer, then you confess everything. What you don't do is go and commit an actual murder to cover up a situation where it might ostensibly look like you've done a murder, but where that was not your intention at all, and you were indirectly involved at most. The level of credibility and follow-up investigation that the characters, including the investigators, give to this possibility, and yes, it is a possibility. It's not impossible, but it is not a probability. When the more obvious fact that both murders were actually murders and possibly done by the same person, probably done by the same person, is misdirection at its most audacious, where Agatha Christie herself cannot have thought for even one moment that her readers would believe this explanation. For even one moment. Unfortunately, though, it turns out her readers would actually be very prescient to believe this sort of an explanation because it's not too far off from one of the final twists that actually happens. One where a character completely unentangled in the actual mystery decides to write and send an anonymous letter of her own, leading unsurprisingly to her own arrest. Okay, it's not that relevant to the final solution at this point, but it's cheap drama and, in my opinion, should have just been totally cut out to make room for the more interesting stuff, such as development of the characters that I pointed out earlier was really subpar, for not all, but for some of the characters. And the abundance of misdirection in this investigation not only distracts from, but actually slightly undermines some of the proper clues. For example, we're told by the police that this must be the work of an educated woman because of forensic typewriter analysis or something of the sort, and it's tempting to just treat this entirely as a non-clue. I mean, I wouldn't go that far because I think when the typewriter experts say they've done this analysis and that it confirms XYZ, we can at least confirm that interpretation, although we should be cautious of the further interpretation that our hasty investigators and our narrator heap on top of it. In any case, I was mostly just willing to take it at face value that we should assume that there was an educated lady involved and not that some murderous husband had ingeniously gone through the trouble of fabricating letters to look like the handiwork of just such a lady. But this is because I still wasn't convinced that the murderer had anything to do with the anonymous letters. Okay then, so who's the murderer for those of you who are just here for the spoiler? My impression was that if you've read this type of book before, sorry, I still have more speculations to describe. My impression was that if you've read this type of book before, without even taking any facts or evidence into account, there's one character who's an extremely obvious suspect, not obviously the murderer, but obviously a suspect for certain reasons. Namely that she's dismissed by most of the characters as obviously not a suspect, even though she obviously is, and this would be the narrator's sister, Joanna, I'm talking about. Agatha Christie certainly wants her seasoned readers to be thinking about Joanna without ever saying as much directly. This simply has to be expected for a character who seems to be erroneously shielded from suspicion, even though she fits the bill of the profile that the police have made out for the letter writer, at least. Joanna's self-centered and apparently sometimes quite nasty personality made it easy to believe that she could be capable at least of writing spiteful anonymous letters for a laugh, though maybe not committing murder, but maybe. Though it wasn't clear to me at all what her motive might be if she was the murderer. Indeed, this was the biggest puzzle for me far into the book, because although she seems like a scheming manipulator used to always getting her way, and although I was half expecting her to be randomly revealed at the end to be the murderer, I just couldn't figure out why she would have wanted to kill Mrs. Symington or see any actual hard evidence that she had done so, or even soft evidence. I mean, she's likely one of the unnamed suspects that the police neglect to mention as they're going through the list of maybe suspects with Jerry, which is obviously intended by the author to add extra probability to one of those people who was not named being the true murderer. And there are also some other unfavorable circumstances for Joanna. For example, she's in the house to hear when Agnes Waddle telephones in concern, and then is never heard from again after that. Ultimately, though, I'm glad it didn't end up being her because I don't think it would have been a satisfying solution. Alternatively, though, could it be Megan, whose main reason for escaping our suspicion is that she seems too sympathetic and she's a little too obvious? By too obvious, I mean the evidence points her in a way that any real murderer, unless they're playing some really advanced mind games, would be sure not to let happen. For example, if the body is hidden in a closet, ostensibly so it won't be found for a while, you'd think that the last thing that the murderer would do is actually go into that closet the next day and self-report the murder. Still, we can't rule out the fact that Megan is actually far smarter than she lets on to be, and that she's using this perception to do away with her mother, who treats her pretty awfully. And it'd be pretty consistent, too, with the discussion that occurs earlier on in the novel between Megan and the narrator, where Megan reveals her sympathy for the scheming daughters Goneril and Regan from King Lear, who she feels must have had good reason for plotting to undermine their patronizing father, King Lear. I mean, adding to that parallel, this is a little bit dumb, but her name is only one letter away from Regan. I suspect Agatha Christie wanted us to think a little bit about Megan as a possible murderer, but not to consider her too seriously for the reasons I mentioned. And if so, I think Christie achieves that quite well. I think that was one of her biggest successes with this character. I have to say, I was quite pleased with what Christie's done here with Megan as a suspect. So if Megan had turned out to be the murderer in the end, that could have been a really satisfying ending in my book, especially if it was one of those mysteries where she's sort of painted out to be a sympathetic murderer. I mean, Christie never really lets the murderer off the hook completely, but sometimes we feel a little bit more empathy for the murderer, and I think that would have been the case there. The actual ending, by contrast, turned out to be quite mundane in comparison to the possibilities I had formulated, which is perhaps my own fault, but frankly, the bad guy turned out to be a pretty uninteresting character who, I'm not going to say there weren't any clues pointing against him, but it also didn't feel like there had really been a proper investigation of him up to that point. For someone so obvious as the husband of the murdered woman, the best that can be said is it does work, it is consistent with the facts, and it's probably about as likely given these facts as any other possibility. I mean, there really were no great candidates in my mind. But on the other hand, this solution feels lackluster and rather incidental to everything else that was going on and capturing my interest in the novel. Part of this, I think, is because, unfortunately, in addition to all these aspects of the mystery plot that I found interesting, there was such a lot of breaking down and going over lists of suspects again and again in a way that I basically just stopped paying much attention to anything unless it really stood out, because it was just such an unfavorable ratio of red herrings to actual meatier clues. I mean, I guess that's how detective work actually works, but you're not reading this story because you actually want to be a detective. That's boring. And add to that the scenes of reviewing which times which people were at which spots and talking to which people, and it makes for a good logic puzzle, but started to make the story itself just a bit dry because I didn't have my 10 by 10 by 10 logic grid to X out all the squares and know the clues and deduce who must have been at the murder place at the time of the murder. Maybe you did that, and if so, you might have figured it out. But it kind of detracted, in my opinion, from the rest of the story. But maybe I'm just complaining too much. For me, it was a little frustrating because I wanted to be fully involved in solving this mystery, as I generally do, but I just don't feel like I got quite as deep in the thick of it as I often do. And I did, for example, with a previous Miss Marple mystery, The Body in the Library. I found myself more enjoying the interactions between the characters involving real matters of personality and depth, rather than all these interactions of a simply transactional and informational nature. Thus, to the extent that clues were revealed in substantial interactions between characters, I was more likely to pick up on those ones. Most of them weren't actually in that kind of interaction, though. Those were mostly the red herrings. But maybe this is just my problem, and I'm complaining because I didn't pay good enough attention. It was worth a read, and I enjoyed thinking about the characters and how things might turn out. And as with all of these mysteries, sometimes the experience is just an intersection of the story itself and the exact mood you're in at the time you read it, and this is one that I think at least some people out there will really end up loving. See you next time, maybe for another Agatha Christie, maybe another mystery, or maybe just something totally different. Bye.